Nobody lives on this island. In 1864, 24 men did, and not one of them chose to. The island took the first ship in January. 5 men, the south end, almost nothing. It took the second in May. 19 men, the north end, everything the others lacked. Then it kept them apart. For 20 months, neither crew learned the other was there. The island was running an experiment, and it had already chosen. It chose on the first morning. One of them came home almost intact. The other was all but wiped out. One of those crews spent that morning making each other a promise. Whichever of them lasted longest would seal the other's diaries in a tin box and bury it by the door, so that whoever landed there next would at least know their names. The first of those wrecks was the Grafton. Her voyage was the idea of a Frenchman named François Raynal, who, by any sensible reckoning, should never have been on a ship. He'd spent 11 years on the Australian goldfields, timbering, hauling, burning charcoal, improvising machinery underground out of whatever was to hand. He got no fortune out of it. What he got was a ruined body and a pocket knife with a small saw in it. In 1863, he heard there was silver-bearing tin on Campbell Island, 600 kilometres south of New Zealand. So he found backers, chartered a schooner, and loaded her at Sydney. Provisions for 4 months, 2 pickaxes and some spade blades to break the ore. For a master, he took Thomas Musgrave, 31, who left a wife and children on the wharf. Musgrave had a quarter share. Everything he owned was in this. And before they sailed, the backers made them a promise. If the Grafton wasn't back in 4 months, they'd send a ship. If they couldn't afford one, they'd ask the government. Campbell Island was a failure. No mine worth having. And Raynal fell ill there. Too ill to walk the ground he'd come 900 miles to survey. So they turned for the Auckland Islands to take seals instead and salvage something from the voyage. On New Year's Day, 1864, anchored in a deep arm of Carnley Harbour, the wind began to rise. It blew 2 days. At 10:30 on the second night, the starboard chain parted. They had 1 anchor left and nothing to replace it. It began to drag. They could feel it dragging. That's the part that's hard to sit with. They had an hour and a half. They knew exactly what was coming and nothing left to do about it. Precisely at midnight, she struck. By 2:15 on the morning of the 3rd of January, she was full of water, broadside on a stone beach. The 5 of them ashore in the dark with what they could carry. Nobody drowned. That was the whole of their luck, and it was spent. They had some canvas, some provisions, and whatever iron they could prize out of her. For woodworking, 4 tools, an axe, an adze, a hammer, and a gimlet. 480 kilometres of ocean lay between them and New Zealand. Nobody lived there. Nobody sailed past, and the only boat they had was the ship's dinghy, old and sprung. They started with the hut, and Raynal's goldfields years began to earn their passage. He knew how to make a building stand up. They cut the planks with the saw in his pocket knife. They burnt shells for lime, thatched the roof, and moved in on the 5th of March. And that first night in a finished house, Raynal lay awake. What frightened him wasn't the island. It was that they'd started snapping at each other. So in the morning, it was Raynal who proposed something extraordinary. The Frenchman, not the captain. He had lain awake most of the night, working out why 5 men on a beach needed a government. These are his words.
It was evident that we had no strength except in union, that discord and division must be our ruin. My idea was that we should choose among us, not a master or a superior, but a chief of the family.
1. The chief keeps order, gently and firmly. 2. He settles every dispute, and his decision is the end of it. 3. Every man has a vote, and the chief has one vote like anybody else. 4. If the chief fails them, they can put it to a vote and remove him. 5. Nobody leaves the settlement alone, and nobody stays out after dark. And 6. They will keep the peace between them, whatever happens. Then they put their hands on the book and swore to it, and read it aloud every Sunday before prayers for the rest of their time there. Then they elected a chief. They elected Musgrave, the captain. Nobody overthrew anything. They took authority that had simply been assumed and made him ask for it, on terms. The rest reads like a household. 5 earthenware plates, one of them cracked. The cracked one went, every time, to whichever man was cooking that week. 28 kilometres north, at the other end of the island, none of that was happening. In May of 1864, while the men in the south were reading their 6 clauses aloud on Sundays, a bark was lying in Melbourne Harbour, taking on nothing at all. She was called the Invercold. She had been built in Aberdeen the year before, out of trees felled on the estate she was named after. Launched in October. She was 6 months old, and this was her second voyage. She sailed for Callao in Peru, empty, to pick up a cargo for England. 25 men went with her, which is simply what a ship that size takes to sail her. Her master was George Dalgarno, 39 years old, an Aberdeen man, and by every account a capable one. 9 days out, in heavy weather, the island was where he did not think it was. At 2 in the morning on the 11th of May, she went onto the rocks at the northwest corner of it. 20 minutes. That is how long she took to come apart.
In about 20 minutes after striking, she was in atoms. So heavy was the sea running. We saved nothing but what we had on our persons.
6 men drowned. One of them was sick below, and nobody went down for him. 19 got ashore. Not one of them had shoes. They had kicked them off in the water to have any chance of swimming. Between them, they had the clothes they stood in and 2 boxes of matches already wet.
It would be utterly impossible to describe the scene that followed after the ship struck. I cannot describe what were our thoughts when we saw the miserable and hopeless condition we were in.
Nothing was written down. Nobody was elected. No rules were agreed. Rank was simply assumed to still be in force, and for a while it was. Only one of the 19 ever set it down on paper. His account sat unpublished for most of a century, and it is nearly the only reason anyone knows what happened next. Back at the South End, they were counting. 4 months was the promise. The 4th month came, then the 5th, then the 6th. Nobody came. Musgrave kept a journal the whole time he was there. On the 15th of May, he wrote this in it.
The idea of the sad lot, which may and must have fallen on those I love so much, wrings my soul with agony. What is life to me, but for their sakes, a mere burden? Let me not have doomed them to wretchedness and misery.
Musgrave's diary from that stretch is hard reading. His family was unprovided for. It drove him mad to think of it. He was writing some of it in seal's blood because the ink had run out. A week later he noted the blood was already fading off the page. And somewhere in that winter, waiting stopped being a plan. Back at the North End that June, Dalgarno made a decision, and it was a real one. The eastern side of the island would be more sheltered. They would cross. It took them a fortnight. Nobody had ever walked it. In places, they went through the scrub on their hands and knees. 4 of them died on the way. 6 others didn't go. They turned back for the wreck instead and rejoined the party a few days later. 5 more separated from the group at one point or another and were never seen again. The place they were making for was called Hardwick, a failed colony, abandoned 12 years, and the roofs were still on. Count what that gave them. More shelter than the Grafton men ever had, nearly 4 times the hands. In his letter home, Dalgarno set down what they were living on.
We also caught 2 seals and found them good food. And had we got plenty of them, no doubt all would have lived. After living 3 months upon limpets, they got done.
In 20 months at the South End, nobody ever left. It had not needed forbidding. There was a clause that let them remove the man in charge, so no one ever had to walk away from him. By that winter, both crews had been ashore the same 8 months. One of them was about to start building a ship. The other had already made the decision that would kill most of them. The day after Christmas, 1864, Raynal started building a pair of blacksmith's bellows. Wreck timber for the boards, sealskin for the lungs. It took him a week. Alec McLaren burned the charcoal to feed it. Wood stacked 3 times his own height, covered in turf, watched until it caught. Years later, Raynal wrote down the moment it first worked.
I presented my companions with a genuine forged bellows of double action, whose power, when I tested it, surpassed all my anticipations. This visible and palpable result was far more eloquent than any reasoning of mine. In the face of this first success, their doubts vanished and hope reinvigorated their hearts.
If the crust cracked, the pile turned to ash. So he worked all day, then got up 20 times a night to check it. Raynal wrote that he never complained. About a year after the wreck, they lit the forge, and Raynal began making the tools to make the tools. Pincers, punches, tongs, a saw cut out of a barrel hoop, all of it drawn out of the wreck's old bolts and cut from the only steel on the island. 2 pickaxes and some spade blades, the mining tools they'd loaded to break the ore. Now they had tools, so they started a ship, about 10 tons. They laid the blocks, cut the timbers, and readied the keel, the stem and the sternpost. And from the day they laid her keel, there was a question none of them said out loud. She was going to be too small for 5. And then Raynal needed one more tool, a long auger, the bit that bores through the heavy upper timbers of a ship. Nothing else will do it. He tried for 2 days. Every time he turned the spiral point so it would bite, the iron burned. He had no steel left worth the name. He wrote that he was forced to confess himself vanquished. By September, Musgrave was writing something very different in the same journal.
I take so many conflicting views of the matter that sometimes my mind is almost, and I am not sure if not quite, wrought up to a state of frenzy. It would be impossible for me to convey to anyone an idea of my present state of mind. God only knows what is to become of us. We shall starve outright if we remain here much longer.
14 months in. The promised search, a year overdue. A keel on the blocks, and every tool that shaped it drawn out of the pickaxes they'd brought to get rich. The ship was the plan. It was the thing they'd been getting up for, and it was not going to exist. For a while, nobody worked on anything. Then they walked down to the water and looked again at the old dinghy, the one they'd written off in the first week. And in May of 1865, while they were cutting that boat in half, a ship came into the North End. She wasn't looking for anybody. She was leaking, and her chart still showed a whaling station there. 3 men walked down the grass to meet her. By then, Smith wrote, the 3 of them had all been thinking the same thing.
We were now reduced to 3, and the thought very naturally arose in our minds, who will be the next to be numbered with the dead?
They had been 3 since the end of that first winter. 16 men dead inside 5 months, and then 8 months more on that island with nobody left to lose. She took them off 12 months and 10 days after the wreck. Not one of them had ever seen the South End. Back at the South End, the 5 of them knew none of it. The island they still thought they were sharing was already empty. From that week, they were the only men on it, and no one alive knew they were there. 12 feet on the keel. Very old and shaky. Shaky was Musgrave's own word. They cut her in half and let 3 feet into her, raised her sides, decked her over. Musgrave cut sails from the Grafton's own canvas, all of it nailed by hand. About 700 nails and spikes and 180 bolts. Every one made on that forge, out of scrap. They set a quota, 50 nails a night. Nobody went to bed until the 50 were done, so the hammer ran until 11 and sometimes midnight. On the 11th of July, 1865, they had a fair wind and everything ready. And the men begged Musgrave not to go. He waited 8 days. Then Musgrave, Raynal, and Alec McLaren pushed out with a ton of stone in her for ballast. She sat so low the old boat was completely submerged. All you could see above the sea was 16 inches of new gunwale. 285 miles, 5 days and nights. They made Port Adventure on Stewart Island on the 24th of July. They'd got themselves off. There were still 2 men on that beach. Musgrave couldn't hire a ship. He had nothing. He asked the general government and the provincial. Both said no. Instead, an Invercargill merchant named John Macpherson took him in off the street, then went out in the rain and knocked on doors until he had it. They found Harris and Forges alive on the 24th of August. 7 weeks. They'd been so short of food they were catching mice. And Musgrave wrote that they couldn't agree, that with only 2 of them on the whole island, they'd been close to separating and living apart. That is what the Constitution was for. It wasn't a nice idea. It's what stopped exactly that happening to 5 men for 20 months. But there is one more thing about that island, and neither crew ever knew it. What happened at the North End, the Grafton men only learned afterwards and in pieces. It is the harder half of this story. They were not short of shelter. Hardwick was still standing at the North End, a street of wooden houses with the roofs on, 12 years empty. In the first weeks after the wreck, they came over a hill and saw it lying below them. Smith never forgot it.
On gaining the top of the hill which overlooked the bay to which we were going, we were cheered beyond expression and leapt for joy at the sight of 2 houses close to the beach.
The houses were empty, and getting to them had already cost. One man never finished the climb off the wreck beach. One sat down in the scrub in the dark and was not found. By the time they reached the far shore, the mate was counting 10 men where there had been 19. Rank had not disappeared. There was still a captain and still a mate. What there was not was anything underneath it. Nothing agreed, nothing written down, nothing any man had been asked to say yes to. On the voyage back for Harris and Forges, Musgrave put into that settlement and found a dead man in the ruins of a house. A slate beside him nobody could read. He buried him without knowing his name. James Mahoney, second mate of the Invercold. Andrew Smith, the mate, wrote a short account of it all and then went quiet for the rest of his life. In it he counts his dead and then makes a confession.
I am sorry to say that I cannot remember their names, as most of our crew were new hands, shipped in Melbourne immediately before we left that port.
And Captain George Dalgarno went home to Scotland by way of America, was given another fine vessel almost at once, and became one of the best-known shipmasters and ship owners in Aberdeen. 3 of the 19 came home. 2 of the 3 were the officers. Go back to the South End, and the ledger reads the other way. The Grafton men were not luckier. They had less. No settlement, no buildings, 4 tools, and 5 men instead of 19. 5 plates, 1 cracked, washed 3 times a day for 19 months without a breakage. A page of clauses that let them fire their captain, never used. 50 nails a night. None of it is heroic. They were frightened too. 5 men agreeing on the first bad morning how they were going to live, and then holding to it for 600 days. The promise made to them was never kept. Nobody came in 4 months, or in 12, or at all. But 3 years later, a brig was sent down to put the first stocked castaway depots on those islands. One of the places they chose was Epigwaitt, the Grafton men's own hut. They patched its roof with timber off the Grafton's wreck, set her bowsprit on the point as a marker, and left inside provisions, a spade, and a box of books. 5 men once agreed that the last one alive would seal the other's diaries in a box by that door, so that whoever came next would at least know their names. They never had to. All 5 of them went home. Somebody else left a box in that hut in the end, and it was full of things a man would need, instead of names he'd never read.